I'm Amelia Fritz, 34, and I've spent over a decade supporting Marine families through deployments, fundraisers, and long nights when loved ones didn't come home. For years, I was the reliable one, showing up quietly, never asking for recognition. But at my sister's wedding, her Navy officer husband leaned in and whispered, "You'll never earn respect." That moment changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone who thought they were above you? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and respect. What happened next might surprise you. I should have seen it coming at the first family barbecue after Stephanie brought him home. Lieutenant Commander Henry Donaldson carried himself like he was still on the bridge of a destroyer, shoulders squared, voice cutting through conversations with military precision. He had this way of standing that claimed territory, feet planted wide, hands clasped behind his back even when we were just talking about weekend plans. "So, what do you do for work?" he asked me that day, but his tone suggested he'd already filed me under unimportant civilian. I told him about my job at the nonprofit, how we coordinated support programs for military families. He nodded politely, then turned to my brother-in-law and launched into a detailed explanation of naval logistics that somehow managed to exclude everyone else from the conversation. Stephanie watched this interaction with bright eyes, clearly proud of her Navy officer. She'd always been drawn to authority figures, even as kids. Our father was career Army, and she used to line up her dolls in perfect formation while I was outside climbing trees or reading books under the oak in our backyard. Now she had her own officer, complete with dress blues and ribbons that caught the light when he moved. The pattern emerged over the next few months. At family dinners, Henry would dominate discussions about current events, referencing classified briefings he couldn't share but somehow managed to allude to constantly. He'd interrupt conversations to correct details about military protocol, even when nobody had asked. When I mentioned attending a friend's promotion ceremony at Quantico, he made a point of explaining Marine versus Navy traditions as if I'd never set foot on a base. "Civilians don't always understand the nuances," he said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. Different services, different cultures. I bit back my response. I'd been attending ceremonies and supporting military families since I was 18. I knew the difference between a Marine colonel and a Navy captain, could spot the subtle hierarchy in how people addressed each other, understood the unspoken rules that governed interactions on base. But explaining that would sound defensive, and something about Henry's certainty made me want to stay quiet and watch instead. The wedding planning revealed more of his character. He insisted on a military ceremony, complete with the Arch of Swords and full dress uniforms for the wedding party. Stephanie was thrilled, of course, but Henry managed to turn every decision into a lecture about tradition and protocol. The florist got a 20-minute explanation of appropriate arrangements for military events. The caterer learned more about Navy customs than she probably wanted to know. I helped where I could, addressing invitations and coordinating with out-of-town relatives. Henry's groomsmen were all Navy, a tight group of officers who spoke in acronyms and inside jokes. They were polite to Stephanie's family, but clearly saw us as supporting cast in Henry's production. When I suggested modifications to the reception timeline to accommodate elderly relatives, Henry's best man actually laughed. "Civilians worry about the strangest things," he said, shaking his head like I'd suggested serving dinner on paper plates. The wedding itself was beautiful. Stephanie looked radiant in her fitted gown, Henry stood at attention in his dress whites, and the ceremony unfolded with military precision. The sword arch photographs were perfect, the reception elegant and smoothly orchestrated. But I noticed how Henry positioned himself throughout the day, always slightly apart from our family, always the officer first and son-in-law second. During the father-daughter dance, I watched him check his watch twice. When Stephanie's college friends started sharing embarrassing stories during the toasts, his smile never quite reached his eyes. He tolerated our civilian traditions rather than embracing them, enduring the evening instead of enjoying it. My parents, both military themselves, seemed to approve of him. Dad appreciated Henry's bearing and professional accomplishments. Mom liked his manners and the way he stood when she entered a room. But I caught them exchanging glances sometimes, subtle looks that suggested they were working harder than usual to find common ground with their new son-in-law. Later, I realized those early interactions were Henry establishing hierarchy. In his world, respect flowed downward from rank and authority. He wasn't being intentionally cruel in those first months. He was simply placing everyone according to his understanding of how the world worked. Stephanie had value because she was his wife. Our parents had value because they were former military. I was just Stephanie's civilian sister, pleasant enough, but ultimately irrelevant to anything that mattered. The signs were subtle but consistent. He'd stand when Stephanie entered a room, but remain seated when I did. He'd ask my father about his army service, but never inquired about my work with military families. During family game nights, he'd partner with Stephanie or my parents, leaving me to team up with whoever was left. Small things, easily dismissed as coincidence or personal preference. But there was something calculated about it. Henry was too intelligent and too well-trained in leadership to be accidentally dismissive. He was making deliberate choices about where to invest his attention and respect. And those choices consistently excluded me from the circle of people he considered worth knowing. Stephanie never seemed to notice. She was busy being a Navy wife, learning the social protocols and attending spouse functions. She'd call me excited about some admiral's reception or commissioning ceremony Henry had brought her to, chattering about the protocol and formality she was still mastering. In her happiness, she missed the subtle ways her husband was reshaping our family dynamics. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Military culture was different from civilian life, and maybe he was still adjusting to our family's more casual approach to relationships. Maybe his formality would ease over time as he got more comfortable with us. Maybe I was reading too much into perfectly normal social interactions. But deep down, I knew better. I'd worked with enough military families to recognize the difference between professional bearing and personal arrogance. Henry wasn't maintaining appropriate boundaries. He was establishing dominance. And in his carefully constructed hierarchy, I ranked somewhere below his notice and well beneath his respect. The realization didn't sting at first. I had my own life, my own work, my own sense of worth that didn't depend on Henry Donaldson's approval. But as months passed and the pattern continued, something shifted. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how he saw civilian contributions to military communities, how he valued the work that kept families together while their loved ones deployed, how he understood service itself. That understanding would matter more than I knew when the real test came. The conversation happened 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when Stephanie had gone shopping with our mother and Henry, and I found ourselves alone in their base housing living room. He'd been helping me move some donated furniture for a military family whose household goods had been delayed, and we'd just finished loading everything into the truck. Coffee, he offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. I accepted, curious about this unexpected moment of normalcy. We'd worked efficiently together for the past 2 hours, coordinating the logistics of furniture donation with the kind of professional competence that made the task smoother for everyone involved. Henry had been genuinely helpful, not performatively so, and his interactions with the receiving family had been appropriately warm rather than calculated. He prepared the coffee with military precision, measuring grounds and water with careful attention to detail. We sat at their dining table, the same table where he'd hosted those carefully orchestrated dinner parties designed to showcase his growing connections with the Marine community. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. The directness surprised me. For months, Henry had been managing our relationship through careful courtesy and diplomatic positioning. I'd assumed he would continue that approach indefinitely, maintaining professional politeness while avoiding any substantive acknowledgement of what had happened between us. At the wedding reception, he continued, "What I said was wrong. Not just inappropriate, but factually incorrect." I waited, letting him work through whatever he needed to say without rushing him toward conclusions he might not be ready to reach. "I made assumptions about your work, about what civilian support means to military communities, about how respect gets earned." He paused, rotating his coffee mug in his hands. I was thinking like someone who'd never actually seen how these communities function. It wasn't a complete apology yet, but it was more honest than anything he'd said to me since the ceremony. I could see him struggling with concepts that challenged his understanding of military hierarchy and institutional value. The Marine who asked you to watch his family, Henry said. That wasn't about volunteer work or community service. That was about trust built over years of proving yourself when it mattered most. Yes, I said simply. I couldn't see that because I was focused on rank and uniform instead of relationships and reliability. He met my eyes directly for the first time in months. I thought respect in military communities flowed down from authority. I didn't understand that it also flows up from service. The admission was significant because it acknowledged that his worldview had been fundamentally incomplete rather than just poorly applied. He wasn't saying he'd misjudged my specific situation. He was saying he'd misunderstood how military communities actually operate. The ceremony, he continued, when those Marines saluted you, that wasn't about political correctness or making civilians feel included. That was about recognizing earned respect. The Marines don't do anything for show, I agreed. That salute meant they considered my service worthy of their highest honor. Henry nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that for months. Trying to understand how I missed something so fundamental about the community I thought I understood. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking coffee and processing the conversation. Outside, the sounds of base life continued. Children playing, families going about their weekend routines, the distant sound of training exercises. The normal rhythm of military community that we'd both become part of in different ways. I want you to know, Henry said finally, that watching you work these past months has taught me things about leadership that I didn't learn in officer training. The way you coordinate support without commanding it, how you build loyalty through consistency rather than authority, those are skills I'm still developing. It was a generous admission from someone whose professional identity was built on leadership competence. But more than that, it suggested he was beginning to understand that effective military communities require different kinds of leadership working in coordination rather than competition. Stephanie talks about you all the time, he added. How proud she is of what you do, how grateful military families are for your support. I realize now that I was hearing those stories through filters that prevented me from understanding what they really meant. Stephanie's proud of you too, I told him. She loves being part of the military community, loves the purpose and structure it gives her life. I know. And part of what makes that community valuable is people like you who support it without needing recognition or official position. He paused. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. The apology was complete now, addressing not just his specific comments at the wedding, but the underlying assumptions that had motivated them. More importantly, it demonstrated genuine learning rather than strategic positioning. Henry had examined his own misconceptions and found them wanting. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. I'd like to start over, he said. Not just with appropriate courtesy, but with actual respect for what you bring to this community. I'd like that too. We finished our coffee and cleaned up the kitchen together, two people who'd found a way past a fundamental misunderstanding towards something approaching genuine respect. When Stephanie and Mom returned from shopping, they found us discussing logistics for the next deployment support initiative, planning coordination between Navy and Marine family services. The conversation was practical, focused, and completely natural. We'd found our footing with each other, not through careful management of appearances, but through honest acknowledgement of mistakes and mutual commitment to doing better. Later, Stephanie mentioned how pleased she was that Henry and I had finally found our rhythm. She was right, but not in the way she imagined. We hadn't simply gotten used to each other's presence. We'd worked through a fundamental disagreement about respect and service and emerged with a relationship built on genuine understanding rather than polite accommodation. The change would prove lasting because it was based on truth rather than strategy. Henry had learned something important about military communities, and I'd gained a family member who finally understood why my work mattered to the people I served. The reception was winding down when Henry found me near the bar, waiting for the bartender to refresh my wine. Stephanie was across the room saying goodbye to her college roommates, radiant in her wedding dress, completely absorbed in the joy of her perfect day. The band had switched to slower songs, and most of the older guests were beginning to make their exits. Henry appeared beside me with his characteristic precision, positioning himself close enough that our conversation would stay private. He loosened his bow tie slightly, but his posture remained military straight. The evening's alcohol hadn't softened his edges. If anything, it had sharpened his confidence. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, but his tone suggested this wasn't really a question. "Beautiful wedding," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Stephanie looks so happy." He nodded, scanning the room with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to assessing situations. "She is. Marriage suits her. Gives her structure, purpose." He paused, rotating his whiskey glass in his hand. "Not everyone adapts well to military life, though." I sensed the conversation shifting, but couldn't predict where it was heading. The spouse group seemed supportive. "She's already made friends. The wives who succeed understand their role," Henry said. "They know how to contribute, how to support the mission. They find their place in the community." His eyes moved back to me, measuring. "Others struggle with the hierarchy. They don't understand that respect has to be earned." Something cold settled in my stomach. Respect usually goes both ways. Henry's smile was thin, calculated. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a claiming of space that forced me to either step back or hold my ground. I held my ground. "You know what I learned in my first deployment?" His voice dropped to just above a whisper, intimate and threatening. "Respect isn't about fairness or reciprocity. It's about earning your place through service, sacrifice, dedication. Real dedication, not the kind of civilian volunteer work that makes people feel important." My face stayed composed, but my pulse quickened. "I see. You seem like a nice enough person," he continued, his tone conversational despite the venom underneath. "But let's be honest about what you bring to the table. You'll never earn respect. Not from men like me. Not from people who've actually served, who've put everything on the line for something bigger than themselves." The words hit like a physical blow, but I'd learned long ago not to let people see when they'd wounded me. Instead, I smiled, the kind of tight, controlled smile that says nothing and reveals nothing. I finished the last sip of my wine, set the glass on the bar, and looked directly into his eyes. "Thank you for the insight," I said calmly. Then I walked away. I made it through the rest of the evening without incident. I hugged Stephanie goodbye, congratulated the happy couple, and helped my parents gather their things. I made appropriate small talk with relatives I hadn't seen in months and posed for final photographs with a smile that looked genuine enough for family albums. But Henry's words echoed in my head during the drive home, during the hours I lay awake staring at the ceiling, during the coffee I couldn't quite finish the next morning. Not because I believed them. I knew my own worth, knew the value of the work I'd done, but because of what they revealed about how he saw the world. In Henry's universe, service meant military service. Sacrifice meant deployment and combat. Dedication meant following orders and maintaining chain of command. Everything else was performance, civilians playing at importance while real heroes did the actual work. My years of supporting military families, attending memorial services, coordinating care packages, and support networks, all of it was diminished to volunteer work that made me feel important. What disturbed me most wasn't his dismissal of my contributions. It was his certainty that this dismissal was justified, that his perspective was the only one that mattered. He hadn't just insulted me, he'd revealed his complete inability to see value in forms of service that didn't come with rank and uniform. Stephanie called the next afternoon to thank me for everything I'd done to help with the wedding. She was still glowing with happiness, full of stories about their honeymoon plans and the apartment they were setting up near the base. She mentioned how well everyone seemed to get along, how smoothly the whole weekend had gone. I agreed with her assessment. There was no point in poisoning her joy with details about her husband's private conversation with me. She was building a new life, and she deserved to do it without my baggage clouding her happiness. But listening to her excitement, I realized that Henry's words had accomplished exactly what he'd intended. He'd established his position clearly and privately, marking territory without causing family drama. It was expertly done, actually. A perfect surgical strike that achieved maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability. If I complained about what he'd said, I'd sound petty and vindictive. If I tried to explain the context and tone, I'd come across as someone who couldn't handle a little honest feedback. He'd chosen his moment and his words carefully, ensuring that any response from me would make me look bad rather than him. But Henry had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that his assessment of my worth was the only one that mattered. He assumed that civilian contributions to military communities were invisible to the people who actually wore the uniform. He assumed that respect was his to grant or withhold based on his narrow understanding of what service meant. In 2 days, I would discover just how wrong he was about all of those assumptions. Before Henry, our family operated on different principles entirely. We were loud and messy and democratic in ways that probably horrified him. Sunday dinners involved everyone talking at once, interrupting with stories, arguing about politics and movies, and whether Mom's lasagna was better this year than last year. Nobody stood at attention when someone entered the room, and respect was something you earned through consistency and kindness rather than rank and ribbons. I was the dependable one in this chaos. The sister who remembered birthdays and anniversary dates, who showed up when people needed help moving or when someone was in the hospital. When Stephanie went through her dramatic breakup with her college boyfriend, I was the one who drove 3 hours to bring ice cream and tissues. When our grandmother was dying, I coordinated the family schedule so someone was always with her. It wasn't heroic or noteworthy. It was just what families do for each other. But somewhere along the way, that reliability extended beyond our immediate circle. I became the person people called when they needed something organized or someone to show up consistently. That's how I got involved with military families in the first place. My college roommate married a Marine fresh out of officer candidate school, and I helped her navigate the first deployment while she was pregnant with their first child. It started with practical things, grocery runs when she was too exhausted to leave the house, babysitting when she had spouse group meetings, being available at 3 in the morning when she needed someone to talk her through the anxiety. One deployment became 2, then 5, then I stopped counting. Word spread through the network of military spouses, and somehow I became the civilian friend who understood the rhythm of military life. I knew when units were deploying, which families needed extra support, how to coordinate meal trains and childcare schedules around training exercises and duty rotations. The work was invisible in the way that most support work is invisible. I wasn't earning medals or getting promoted. I wasn't making life or death decisions or leading troops in combat. I was just showing up consistently, being the steady presence that military families could count on when their lives were built around uncertainty. Over the years, that consistency earned me something I hadn't expected: acceptance into a community that usually keeps civilians at arm's length. Marines started knowing my name, recognizing me at ceremonies and base events. Spouses introduced me to new families as someone who could help them navigate their first duty station. Officers who'd known me for years would stop to catch up, asking about my work and sharing updates about their careers. I attended change of command ceremonies and promotion parties. I was invited to Marine Corps birthday balls and unit social events. I knew the difference between enlisted and officer protocol, understood the subtle hierarchies and traditions that governed base life. But I wasn't studying military culture from the outside. I was living within it as a trusted civilian partner. The relationships ran deeper than social courtesy. I'd sat in hospital waiting rooms during training accidents, attended funeral services for Marines killed in action, helped families pack and move when orders came through. I'd written letters to deployed Marines, coordinated surprise homecoming events, and spent countless hours listening to spouses work through the challenges of military life. These weren't abstract acts of service. They were personal relationships built over years of showing up when it mattered. The Marine who asked me to walk his daughter down the aisle when his deployment kept him from her wedding. The spouse who called me first when her husband was wounded in Afghanistan. The commanding officer who insisted I attend his retirement ceremony because, as he put it, I'd been part of his unit's family for longer than most of his Marines. Henry saw none of this history when he assessed my worthiness. He saw a civilian woman who attended military events and assumed I was there as someone's guest, playing at understanding a world I couldn't really comprehend. He saw volunteer work where I saw relationships. He saw someone seeking importance where I saw someone fulfilling responsibilities. But the Marines I'd worked with for years saw something different. They saw consistency and loyalty and the kind of quiet service that keeps communities functioning. They'd watched me show up during the hardest moments, stay involved through multiple deployments, and treat their families with the same dedication I showed my own. That history mattered in ways Henry couldn't understand. Military communities are built on trust and proven reliability. Rank gets you initial respect, but keeping that respect requires demonstrating that you'll be there when people need you most. I'd been demonstrating that reliability for over a decade, earning trust that couldn't be shaken by one person's dismissal. The irony was that Henry's own understanding of military service was relatively narrow. He was Navy, focused on ship operations and naval warfare. He understood his piece of the military machine, but he'd spent limited time in the kind of joint operations where Marines, sailors, soldiers, and airmen work together. He knew protocol and hierarchy, but he'd missed the broader truth about military communities. They function because of relationships that cross traditional boundaries. I'd learned this truth by living it. The Marine sergeant who helped me understand base security procedures. The Navy chaplain who taught me how to support grieving families. The Army logistics officer who showed me how to coordinate large-scale volunteer efforts. These weren't people granting me special access. They were colleagues who'd recognized my commitment and helped me become more effective at supporting their communities. 2 days after Henry's wedding reception whisper, all of that history would converge into a single moment of recognition. But I couldn't have predicted how powerful that moment would be, or how completely it would reframe the conversation about who deserved respect and why. For now, I just knew that Henry Donaldson had severely underestimated both my place in the military community and the relationships I'd built there over years of quiet, consistent service. That night replayed in my head for 48 hours straight, each repetition highlighting different aspects of what had happened. Henry's positioning when he approached me, calculated to create intimacy and intimidation simultaneously. The way he timed the conversation for maximum impact, waiting until Stephanie was distracted and the evening was winding down. His choice of words, precisely calibrated to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. You'll never earn respect. Not from men like me. The phrase haunted me because of its specificity. Not, you haven't earned respect, or you might not earn respect, but you'll never earn respect. The finality was absolute, the judgment complete. In Henry's worldview, there was no path forward for someone like me, no possibility of proving worth or demonstrating value. The verdict was permanent and non-negotiable. But what disturbed me most wasn't the personal attack. It was what the words revealed about his understanding of service itself. Henry had reduced the entire concept of military support to those who wore the uniform and those who didn't. Everyone else, spouses, families, civilian support networks, community volunteers, existed in a secondary category, valuable perhaps, but never worthy of true respect. This dismissal wasn't just about me. It was about every military spouse who'd held families together during deployments. Every parent who'd supported their child through multiple moves and school changes. Every civilian contractor who'd worked alongside uniformed personnel in dangerous conditions. Every community member who'd provided support services that kept military families functioning. Henry's worldview erased all of these contributions, reducing them to civilian volunteer work that makes people feel important. He couldn't see past the uniform to recognize the broader network of service that makes military communities possible. In his hierarchy, respect flowed only to those who'd taken an oath and worn government-issued clothing. I spent those 2 days thinking about the Marines I'd known who understood service differently. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd told me that the strongest Marines were those who understood they were part of something bigger than themselves. Colonel Washington, who'd insisted that military effectiveness depended on civilian support networks. Master Sergeant Chin, who'd explained that real leadership meant recognizing contributions from unexpected sources. These Marines had taught me that service wasn't about rank or uniform, it was about showing up consistently when people needed you most. They'd seen my work with military families not as civilian volunteering, but as essential mission support. They understood that deployment success depended partly on knowing that families back home were cared for by people they could trust. Henry's dismissal revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how military communities actually function. He saw hierarchy where others saw collaboration. He saw exclusive membership where others saw extended family. He saw his position at the top of a rigid structure where others saw themselves as part of a complex network of mutual support. The realization that emerged from those 48 hours of reflection was simple but profound. Henry's assessment of my worth was irrelevant because he'd completely misunderstood the community he claimed to represent. His respect wasn't mine to earn because he didn't understand what respect meant in the context of military service. But understanding this intellectually didn't diminish the sting of his words or the anger that built each time I remembered his smug certainty. He'd spoken to me like I was a child pretending to understand adult conversations. He'd dismissed years of relationships and service with casual contempt. He'd made assumptions about my motivations and contributions without bothering to learn anything about my actual history. The anger was productive, though. It clarified my thinking and strengthened my resolve. I wouldn't defend myself to Henry because defense implied that his judgment mattered. I wouldn't try to educate him about my contributions because teaching required a willing student. I wouldn't shrink away from future family gatherings because his comfort wasn't my responsibility. Instead, I would do exactly what I'd always done: show up consistently, maintain my relationships, and continue the work that had earned me a place in the military community long before Henry Donaldson arrived on the scene. His respect was neither necessary for my effectiveness nor required for my sense of worth. The decision felt liberating. For years, I'd occasionally wondered if I was overstepping boundaries or presuming too much familiarity with military protocols. Henry's attack had forced me to examine those relationships honestly, and what I found was a network of genuine friendships and professional partnerships built on mutual respect and shared commitment. I didn't need Henry's validation because I already had something more valuable: the trust of people who understood military service from the inside. They'd seen my work over years and decided it was worth supporting. They'd included me in their community because they recognized my contributions as meaningful and necessary. 2 days after the wedding reception, I would discover just how deep that recognition ran and how publicly the Marine Corps was willing to demonstrate it. But even without knowing what was coming, I felt a quiet confidence that Henry's assessment of my worthiness would prove spectacularly wrong. His whispered dismissal had been meant to diminish me. Instead, it had reminded me of exactly who I was and what I'd spent years building with people who actually mattered. The decision crystallized while I was drinking coffee at 6 in the morning, staring out my kitchen window at the rain. I wouldn't defend myself to Henry because defense implied his judgment carried weight. I wouldn't avoid family gatherings because his comfort wasn't my responsibility. And I certainly wouldn't shrink away from the military community where I'd built genuine relationships over more than a decade. Instead, I would do exactly what had earned me respect in the first place: show up consistently and let my actions speak for themselves. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Colonel Martinez called that Tuesday morning about the ceremony scheduled for Thursday. The 2nd Battalion was conducting a change of command, transitioning leadership before their upcoming deployment. As the longtime coordinator for Family Support Services, I'd been invited to attend and help facilitate the reception afterward. "We'll need help with logistics," Colonel Martinez explained. "Protocol coordination, guest management, the usual. Can you be there by 0800? I could have declined. The smart move might have been to step back for a while, let Henry's words fade into memory, avoid any situation that might create family tension. But stepping back would validate his dismissal. It would suggest that his assessment had merit, that I was indeed overreaching my place in the military community. "I'll be there," I told Colonel Martinez. "Outstanding. Oh, and bring your usual team. We're expecting significant attendance." My usual team consisted of 6 civilians who'd worked with me on various support initiatives over the years. We'd coordinated everything from deployment send-offs to memorial services, becoming a reliable resource for event management on base. The Marines trusted us to handle details while they focused on ceremony and protocol. I called the team members Wednesday evening, confirming their availability and outlining responsibilities. Stephanie called while I was reviewing the checklist, bubbling with excitement about her honeymoon plans. "Henry's been so relaxed since the wedding," she said. "I think having everything official has really settled him. He's even talking about hosting family dinners once we get established in base housing." I made appropriate responses, letting her share her happiness without clouding it with my own complications. But I couldn't help noting the irony. Henry felt settled and official now, secure in his position and ready to play host to our family. He'd claimed his territory and established his hierarchy, confident that everyone understood their place. Thursday morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. I arrived at 0730, meeting my team at the main gate. We'd worked together long enough that coordination was almost automatic. Jennifer handled parking and guest reception. Mike managed equipment and setup. Stephanie T. coordinated with the catering staff. The others took care of security liaison and protocol details. By 0800, we had the logistics running smoothly. Guest registration was efficient, the sound system was tested and functional, and the reception area was properly arranged. Colonel Martinez found me near the ceremony site, reviewing the timeline one final time. "Everything looks perfect," he said. "The Marines appreciate what you do for these events. Having civilians who understand military protocol makes everything smoother." I nodded my thanks, but my attention was caught by movement near the guest seating area. Henry had arrived in dress blues, looking every inch the professional naval officer. He was talking to Stephanie, who looked elegant in a navy dress appropriate for military ceremonies. They'd chosen seats with a clear view of the proceedings, close enough to demonstrate their connection to the military community. Henry's posture was confident, relaxed even. He surveyed the ceremony preparations with the satisfied air of someone who belonged, who understood the significance of what was happening. When he noticed me coordinating with the Marines, his expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but a subtle recalibration of his expectations. I stayed focused on the work. The ceremony would begin in 30 minutes, and there were final details to confirm. The guest list included family members, local officials, and Marines from multiple units. The change of command itself was formal and traditional, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. But I knew something Henry didn't know. This wasn't just a change of command ceremony. The outgoing commander, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, had served 2 tours with the 2nd Battalion and was transitioning to a staff position at Headquarters Marine Corps. The Marines wanted to honor his leadership with something special, something that would demonstrate the unit's respect and gratitude. They'd been planning the tribute for weeks, coordinating with Marines from other units who'd served under Stevens' command. The details were kept quiet, shared only with those who needed to know for logistical purposes. Even I didn't know all the specifics, just that additional personnel would be participating and that the ceremony would run longer than usual. Henry had positioned himself perfectly to observe the proceedings, close enough to appreciate the military pageantry and protocol he valued so highly. Stephanie sat beside him, clearly proud to be attending such an impressive event with her Navy officer husband. They made a handsome couple, representing exactly the kind of military family that base ceremonies celebrated. What neither of them could see was the larger picture developing around us. Marines were arriving from multiple units, more than would normally attend a single battalion ceremony. They moved with quiet efficiency, taking positions that wouldn't be obvious to civilian guests, but would be unmistakable to anyone who understood military formations. The ceremony began promptly at 0900 with the presentation of colors and the playing of the national anthem. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens delivered his farewell remarks with the measured dignity appropriate to the occasion. The incoming commander, Lieutenant Colonel Park, accepted responsibility for the battalion with formal precision. Everything proceeded according to standard protocol until the moment when Lieutenant Colonel Stevens called for the unit to form up for his final review. That's when Henry would discover just how wrong he'd been about my place in the Marine Corps community. The ceremony concluded with textbook precision. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens completed his farewell address, Lieutenant Colonel Park assumed command, and the formal proceedings moved toward their traditional close. Henry sat in the guest seating area, clearly appreciating the military pageantry and protocol. He'd positioned himself where he could observe everything, the satisfied smile of someone who understood the significance of what he was witnessing. But as the Marines began forming up for the final review, something shifted. Instead of the single battalion organizing into standard formation, Marines from multiple units started moving with quiet efficiency. They came from different directions, wearing the dress blues that signified this was more than routine ceremony. I watched from my position near the coordination area, still focused on logistics and guest management. My team was preparing for the reception transition, ensuring that everything would flow smoothly once the ceremony concluded. But I could see the larger pattern emerging as more Marines took their positions. Colonel Martinez appeared beside me, checking his watch. "Right on schedule," he said quietly. "Stevens earned this." Lieutenant Colonel Stevens moved to the center of the formation area, his bearing dignified and ceremonial. He'd served the Corps for over 20 years, including multiple combat deployments and command positions. His farewell was more than administrative transition. It was the end of a distinguished career built on leadership and service. "Battalion, attention!" The command echoed across the ceremonial area. What happened next exceeded even my expectations. Marines snapped to attention in perfect unison, but the formation was larger than anyone had anticipated. Row after row of dress blues created geometric precision on the parade ground. The sound of boots striking pavement was thunderous, unified, unmistakable. Then Lieutenant Colonel Stevens did something that broke from standard protocol. Instead of conducting his final review from the traditional position, he walked toward where I stood with the other coordinators. "This ceremony wouldn't be possible without the civilian support that keeps our families strong while we serve," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the formation. "Some people serve without uniforms, but their dedication to this community deserves recognition." I felt the attention of 200 Marines shifting in my direction. The moment stretched, formal and weighty with significance I hadn't fully anticipated. Stevens continued speaking, but his words were eclipsed by what happened next. "Present arms." The command cracked like a whip across the parade ground. 200 Marines moved as one, bringing their rifles to present position with mechanical precision. But they weren't presenting arms to Lieutenant Colonel Stevens or the colors or any traditional object of military courtesy. They were presenting arms to me. The salute was absolute, perfect, and unmistakable. Every Marine in that formation was acknowledging my service to their community with the highest form of military respect. The rifles held steady, the formation unmoving, the silence complete except for the sound of my own heartbeat. I stood motionless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture. This wasn't casual recognition or polite acknowledgement. This was the Marine Corps formally declaring that my contributions had earned their highest respect, demonstrated through the most traditional and significant ceremony in military culture. From my peripheral vision, I could see Henry in the guest seating area. His confident posture had disappeared entirely. His face was pale, his jaw tight with the kind of shock that comes from having your fundamental assumptions completely overturned. Stephanie sat beside him, clearly confused by what was happening but recognizing its significance. The salute held for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then Lieutenant Colonel Stevens called "Order arms," and the rifles came down in perfect unison. The formation remained at attention, 200 Marines standing in tribute to civilian service that most people never see or acknowledge. "Thank you," Stevens said simply. Then he returned to his position and completed the ceremony according to standard protocol. But the damage to Henry's worldview was complete and irreversible. He'd witnessed his sister-in-law receive the highest military honor short of medal presentation, demonstrated by Marines who'd chosen to break from traditional ceremony to acknowledge her contributions. Every assumption he'd made about civilian worthiness and military respect had been publicly contradicted by the very people he claimed to represent. The reception afterward passed in a blur of congratulations and conversations. Marines who'd known me for years shared stories of deployments and family support. Officers who'd worked with me on various initiatives expressed gratitude for coordination and assistance that had made their jobs easier. The civilian coordinators on my team were included in these conversations, recognized as essential partners rather than helpful outsiders. Henry avoided me completely during the reception. He stayed close to Stephanie, making polite conversation with other Navy personnel and maintaining the appearance of social engagement. But his earlier confidence was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who discovered that his understanding of the situation was fundamentally flawed. Near the end of the event, Colonel Martinez found me one final time. "The Marines wanted you to know that salute wasn't symbolic," he said. "It was earned through years of service that most people never see." Stevens insisted on it, but the idea came from the Marines themselves. I thanked him, still processing what had happened. The ceremony had answered Henry's dismissal more completely than any argument or defense could have managed. 200 Marines had declared publicly that respect in military communities was earned through service and dedication, regardless of uniform or rank. The weeks following the ceremony passed with an odd sort of quiet tension that everyone in the family could feel, but nobody directly addressed. Henry hadn't said a word to me about what happened at the change of command, hadn't acknowledged the salute or asked about my history with the Marines. Instead, he'd retreated into a careful politeness that was somehow more unsettling than his previous dismissiveness. At the first family gathering after the ceremony, he stood when I entered the room. The gesture was subtle, automatic, the kind of respectful response he'd offer to any woman entering a room, but I'd never seen him do it before when it was just me. Stephanie noticed, glancing between us with mild confusion, but didn't comment. During dinner, when I mentioned coordinating an upcoming fundraiser for wounded warriors, Henry listened without interruption. No corrections about military protocol, no explanations of how these things really worked, no subtle suggestions that I might be overstepping civilian boundaries. Just quiet attention and appropriate nods at appropriate moments. The change would have been welcome if it had felt genuine. Instead, it carried the careful calculation of someone who'd been forced to recalibrate his strategy. Henry wasn't acknowledging that he'd been wrong about my place in the military community. He was simply adjusting his behavior to account for information he hadn't previously possessed. Stephanie seemed pleased with what she interpreted as her husband and sister finally finding their rhythm with each other. She'd been worried about family dynamics, though she'd never said so directly. Now she relaxed into conversations that included both of us, planning holiday gatherings and talking about future family events with the assumption that everyone was getting along. But I could see Henry's discomfort in the spaces between his careful courtesy. When other family members talked about my work with military families, he'd find reasons to step away from the conversation. When someone mentioned the ceremony at the base, he'd change the subject with the smooth deflection of someone trained in diplomatic maneuvering. He was present but not engaged, polite but not warm, correct but not comfortable. The avoidance extended beyond family gatherings. Stephanie mentioned that Henry had started declining social events where he might encounter Marines from the local base. He developed scheduling conflicts that prevented attendance at military social functions, citing work obligations and professional commitments that kept him busy on evenings when he might run into people who'd witnessed the ceremony. "He's been so focused on his career lately," Stephanie explained during one of our phone conversations. "The promotion boards are coming up, and he wants to make sure his record is perfect. Sometimes I think he forgets there's life outside the Navy." I made sympathetic sounds, but I suspected Henry's sudden career focus had less to do with promotion boards and more to do with avoiding situations where his assessment of civilian worthiness might be publicly contradicted again. The ceremony had demonstrated that his understanding of military community was incomplete, and he was struggling to reconcile that reality with his sense of professional identity. The irony was that his avoidance was making things worse rather than better. By declining invitations and avoiding social events, Henry was isolating himself from the very community he claimed to represent. The Marines who'd known me for years were starting to notice his absence, asking Stephanie where her husband was and why they never saw him at unit functions anymore. Colonel Martinez mentioned it to me during a planning meeting for the annual Marine Corps birthday celebration. "We haven't seen Lieutenant Commander Donaldson lately," he said casually. "Hope everything's okay with your family." I assured him that everything was fine, that Henry was just busy with Navy obligations. But the question highlighted how Henry's retreat was becoming noticeable to people who valued community participation and social connection. In trying to avoid confronting his misconceptions, he was actually undermining his standing in the military community. Meanwhile, my own relationships continued as they always had. I coordinated support services, attended ceremonies, and maintained the network of connections that had developed over years of consistent involvement. The ceremony had changed nothing about the actual work. It had simply made visible the respect that had been building quietly for more than a decade. But Henry's reaction had changed the family dynamic in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Stephanie was starting to ask more pointed questions about why her husband seemed uncomfortable around her family, why he'd become so focused on work that he rarely engaged in conversations about anything else. She couldn't directly address what she sensed, but didn't understand. The situation reached a turning point during our parents' anniversary celebration. Dad had reserved a private dining room at the country club, and the whole family was expected to attend. Henry couldn't decline without seeming deliberately antisocial, but his discomfort was obvious from the moment he and Stephanie arrived. He positioned himself carefully throughout the evening, choosing seats that allowed him to participate in general conversation without being drawn into specific discussions about my work or military community involvement. When Dad proposed a toast celebrating family support during his own military career, Henry raised his glass appropriately but avoided making eye contact with me. The moment that crystallized everything came during dessert, when Mom started telling stories about military wives during Dad's Vietnam deployment. She talked about the networks of support that kept families functioning during that difficult time, the civilian volunteers who coordinated everything from childcare to emergency assistance. "Women like that don't get recognition," Mom said, looking around the table with the authority of someone who'd lived through multiple deployments. "But they keep everything together while the men are gone." The military couldn't function without that kind of civilian support. It was an innocent comment, not directed at anyone specifically, but Henry's reaction was immediate and telling. He excused himself to take a phone call, leaving the table for nearly 15 minutes while the rest of us continued sharing stories and family memories. When he returned, his professional composure was back in place, but something had shifted. The careful politeness was strained now, requiring visible effort to maintain. Stephanie noticed too, glancing at her husband with growing concern about behavior she couldn't explain. After dinner, as we were saying goodbyes in the parking lot, Henry finally acknowledged the elephant that had been following us around for weeks. He waited until Stephanie was distracted, talking to Mom about upcoming holiday plans, then approached me with the same calculated positioning he'd used at the wedding reception. "I think we need to clear the air," he said quietly. I waited, curious to see how he would address what had happened without admitting he'd been wrong about anything fundamental. "That ceremony was impressive," he continued. "I can see that you've built relationships I wasn't aware of." It wasn't an apology exactly. More like a tactical acknowledgement that his intelligence had been incomplete. He wasn't conceding that civilian service deserved respect. He was simply noting that my particular situation was more complex than he'd initially assessed. "The Marines have been good to work with over the years," I replied neutrally. "I'm sure they have." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I hope you understand that my comment at the wedding wasn't personal. It's just that military culture can be particular about boundaries." Again, not an apology but a reframing that suggested his dismissal had been about appropriate protocol rather than personal judgment. He was trying to reset our relationship without admitting that his original assessment had been fundamentally flawed. "I understand," I said, though what I understood was that Henry would never acknowledge being wrong about something so central to his identity. He nodded, apparently satisfied that we'd achieved some kind of détente. But as we rejoined our respective family members and finished the evening's goodbyes, I realized that nothing had actually been resolved. Henry had simply found a face-saving way to explain why he needed to treat me differently going forward. The careful distance would continue, but now it would be framed as appropriate respect for boundaries rather than dismissal of civilian contributions. He could maintain his worldview while adjusting his behavior, avoiding future public contradictions without actually examining his assumptions. It was a skillful piece of diplomatic maneuvering, exactly what I would have expected from a professional military officer. But it also confirmed that the fundamental divide between us hadn't been bridged, just better managed. 6 months later, the new equilibrium had settled into something that looked like normalcy but felt like a carefully choreographed performance. Henry's behavior toward me remained scrupulously correct. He stood when I entered rooms, included me in conversations appropriately, and never again suggested that civilian contributions to military communities were somehow lesser or unworthy. But beneath this surface courtesy, nothing had fundamentally changed. He still didn't understand what I did or why it mattered to the Marines I worked with. He'd simply learned that dismissing it publicly would reflect poorly on his own understanding of military community dynamics. The ceremony had taught him that my position was more secure than he'd realized, not that his original assessment was wrong. Stephanie seemed happier with the family dynamics now that her husband and sister were getting along better. She'd started hosting monthly dinners at their base housing, carefully planned events that showcased her growing skills as a Navy wife. Henry would hold my chair and make appropriate conversation, playing the role of gracious host with the same precision he brought to all his military duties. These dinner parties revealed another layer of his adaptation strategy. He'd begun cultivating relationships with Marines from the base, not because he developed new respect for the Corps, but because he'd recognized that those relationships enhanced his own standing in the joint military community. The same calculation that had led him to dismiss my civilian contributions now led him to embrace visible association with the Marines who'd saluted me. It was expertly done, actually. Henry would mention his sister-in-law's work with military families in conversations with Marine officers, positioning himself as someone who understood and supported inter-service cooperation. He'd attend ceremonies where he knew I'd be coordinating logistics, making sure to be seen engaging positively with the Marines I worked with regularly. The irony was that his calculated networking was actually making him a better officer. Forced to interact meaningfully with Marines, he was learning aspects of military culture that his Navy-centric worldview had previously missed. His understanding of joint operations improved, his appreciation for different service traditions deepened, and his ability to work across military branches expanded significantly. But I could see the effort it required. Henry was playing a role rather than experiencing genuine growth, adapting his behavior to serve his professional interests rather than examining his underlying assumptions. The Marines he cultivated relationships with appreciated his attention, but they also recognized the careful calculation behind his sudden interest in inter-service cooperation. Colonel Martinez mentioned it during one of our routine coordination meetings. "Your brother-in-law has been making an effort to connect with the Marine community," he said diplomatically. "It's good to see Navy officers taking initiative on joint relations." The phrasing was careful, professional, but I caught the subtext. Marines valued authenticity and were skilled at recognizing when someone was working an angle. Henry's networking was appreciated for its practical benefits, but it wasn't earning him the kind of genuine respect that came from years of consistent commitment. Meanwhile, my own work continued unchanged. The relationships I'd built over more than a decade didn't require maintenance or calculation. They were based on mutual trust and shared commitment to supporting military families. When Marines deployed, their spouses knew they could count on me. When families faced emergencies, they called because they knew I'd show up consistently. The contrast between Henry's careful cultivation and my established integration became more apparent over time. At social events, Marines would seek me out for conversations about ongoing projects and family updates. They'd approach Henry politely, but didn't include him in the deeper discussions about community challenges and support needs. This dynamic created subtle tensions that Stephanie couldn't quite identify, but definitely sensed. She'd noticed that conversations shifted when Henry joined groups where I was already talking with Marines. She'd see how differently people interacted with each of us, even though both interactions appeared positive on the surface. The turning point came during the unit's pre-deployment ceremony in the fall. Henry attended in dress whites, representing the Navy's support for joint operations. I coordinated logistics with my usual team, ensuring that families had the support they needed during what was always an emotional event. During the reception afterward, Lieutenant Colonel Park approached Henry and me while we were standing together near the refreshment table. "Commander Donaldson," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you for the Navy's support during our preparation phase. The inter-service cooperation has been outstanding." Henry accepted the thanks gracefully, responding with appropriate remarks about joint operations and mutual support. Then Park turned to me with a completely different tone. "And we couldn't do any of this without you," he said simply. "The families know you'll be here while we're gone. That peace of mind is worth more than you know." The difference in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Park's thanks to Henry were professionally appropriate, recognizing his institutional role and official position. His comments to me were personally meaningful, acknowledging relationships built over years of shared experience. Henry heard the difference too. His response was perfectly correct. He thanked Park for including him in the recognition and made appropriate comments about civilian contributions to military readiness. But I could see him processing the interaction, trying to understand why his calculated networking hadn't earned him the same kind of personal appreciation. Later that evening, as families were saying their final goodbyes before the deployment, Henry witnessed something that completed his education about respect in military communities. A young Marine approached me hesitantly, clearly struggling with emotion as the reality of leaving his family hit him fully. "Will you make sure they're okay while I'm gone?" he asked quietly. "My wife, the kids, this is our first deployment." "Of course," I told him. "I'll check in regularly, and I'm always available if they need anything." The relief on his face was immediate and profound. He wasn't asking for generic support services or official assistance programs. He was asking me personally to watch over the people he loved most, trusting me with the responsibility that mattered more than anything else in his world. Henry watched this interaction with something approaching comprehension. For the first time, he seemed to understand that respect in military communities wasn't about rank or networking or professional positioning. It was about trust earned through years of proving that you'd be there when people needed you most. That moment of understanding would prove to be the foundation for the only genuine conversation we'd ever have about what had happened between us. And that's how 200 Marines showed me that respect isn't granted by rank, it's earned through consistency and service. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only for life to prove them wrong? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that their worth can't be defined by anyone else.